Thank you for joining the Holocaust Center for Humanities Lunch and Learn program today. I'm Alana Cohn-Kennedy, the Holocaust Center's Director of Education. For the first time today, we are trying out closed captioning, which you will find at the bottom of your screen. Thank you to Michelle Quinones, who is volunteering to keep up with our conversation and provide this option. On March 22nd, 1909, Washington State became the second state in the nation to pass a law allowing for the forced sterilization of people with disabilities and other citizens in the name of improving society. The idea of the then popular eugenics movement was to, quote, cleanse the gene pool of undesirable traits. In the early 1900s in the United States, sterilization was used to control, quote, undesirable populations, which meant people of color, poor people, unmarried mothers, the disabled, and the mentally ill. When Hitler and the Nazi Party began forced sterilization of people with physical and mental disabilities in the 1930s, the idea was hardly a new one. It was already being done in the United States. I mention this because we are at what's hopefully a turning point in our history when we must directly face our own country's systematic mistreatment and dehumanization of entire groups of people. With us today is Dr. Beth Griech-Polelle, a professor at Pacific Lutheran University in Tacoma, to discuss the Nazis' progression from discrimination to sterilization to murder of mentally and physically disabled people, and also to humanize these victims, which are too frequently only statistics. Beth is the Kurt Mayer Chair of Holocaust Studies at Pacific Lutheran University. She is the author of several books and articles and is currently under contract with Bloomsbury Academic Press to write a textbook on anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. In addition, she has recently been invited to serve on the steering committee for higher education learning at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. If you have questions during the program, please type them in at any time into the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. We will be asking questions periodically throughout the program. Beth, it is an honor to have you with us today to talk about this important and often overlooked aspect of the Holocaust.
Hi, thank you for having me, Alana. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to a nice audience. And as you said, we'll take questions as we go, and I'll try to talk slowly. So I'll try to rein in my enthusiasm for this topic and speak slowly.
Great. So Beth, let me start with just giving a little context and then asking you a question. On July 14th, 1933, the Nazi government instituted the Law for the Prevention of Progeny with Hereditary Diseases. This law was one of the first steps taken by the Nazis toward their goal of creating an Aryan master race. And it called for the sterilization of all people who suffered from diseases considered hereditary, such as mental illness, learning disabilities, physical deformity, epilepsy, blindness, deafness, and severe alcoholism. With the law's passage, the Third Reich also stepped up its propaganda against people with disabilities, regularly labeling them, quote, life unworthy of life, or, quote, useless eaters, and highlighting their burden upon society. How was this law received by the German people?
That is a very good question. And you can see on your screens this image of propaganda where the Nazi regime truly embraced what was called the Eugenics Movement. The Eugenics Movement started in the 1880s. The word itself was coined by the cousin of Charles Darwin. His name is Sir Francis Galton, and he was a mathematician. And throughout the late 19th and early 20th century, this eugenics movement really became a hallmark of progressive era politics, not just in America, but overseas in England, and then picked up in Germany as well. And so when Hitler introduces eugenics ideas to the German people, they've already been exposed to them to a certain extent, right? That this has already been floating around. And so once the Nazis have seized power in 1933, Hitler is embraced by eugenics followers, and they say he is the one true political leader who really understands the need to so-called prune the population. And as you said in your introduction, this eugenics idea was they're going to somehow weed out undesirable traits and qualities. It has a ring of science about it, but of course it's all very subjective. And for the Nazis, they bombard the German people with these types of propaganda images that suggest that if you have a hereditary illness, a disease, that you are lumped in with being a criminal. And in 1934, Hitler announced this was the year for German people for their duty to be healthy. And so to be unhealthy in any respect was regarded as a crime against Nazism. And so for many German people, these ideas were already around, but the Nazis are really going to start bombarding them with them. And so that not just in these images of kind of propaganda posters, they're going to produce all types of short films, feature films that promote these ideas of, again, eugenics policies, pruning the population. And I think probably one of the most revealing answers to the question that you posed about how do German people respond to this, when that law against hereditarily diseased people went into effect on January 1st, 1934, the Nazi regime was not at all certain how the German people would respond. But in the court system that they had set up was overwhelmed with 259,051 denunciations by German people against other Germans. And they were not at all anticipating that enormous type of response. And this included people telling on their own family members and denouncing them to what were called hereditary health courts. And so I think that's very revealing about how many German people were already on board this idea that there were unhealthy elements in the German population and that they would be doing society a favor by getting rid of these types of people, or at the very least, not allowing those types of people to continue to reproduce and possibly pass those traits on to another generation.
Thank you. I just want to make a note. We understand the captioning isn't working at the moment. Possibly we'll get it working again. Just want to let you know if you're trying to use it, it's on our end. We're working on it. So Beth, as you mentioned, eugenics was a popular scientific, quote, scientific movement in the United States, but was also followed in Germany, and people believed in this idea, which is why maybe they were so quick to denounce their own family members. And the idea of it was to improve the genetic quality of people, as you mentioned. This quote, science is legitimized by the science legitimized the inferiority of people with mental illness and others. Were the Nazi policies influenced by the eugenics movement in the United States?
Most definitely, yes. And there's a really interesting short book by a professor of law at Yale University called Hitler's American Model. And it's done by a man named James Q. Whitman. And I would recommend for people who really want to know this interconnection between American eugenicists and German movements in eugenics, I would recommend that as a book. So the short answer is that most definitely there were groups located mostly in Berlin and in Munich, and they were two kind of competing scientific factions. And they essentially were working together to promote the ideas of eugenics, but they were looking to the American so-called scientific community to say, well, what are they doing? And what's very maybe shocking to people is that for many of the Germans, they believed that America and its eugenics policies was going too far. And they said, well, you can't do the things that you're doing. And so in the earlier phases, Germans were kind of looking at America and they were fairly envious because they said, look, they're going to have their genetic problems done away with before we do, right? They're moving far in advance. And so for many of them, the idea was that America has gone too far. And just to kind of throw out just a few examples of names of Americans that people will probably recognize, a man from the Kellogg family. Every time you buy Kellogg cereal, right, you don't necessarily think of the Kellogg family of being involved in America's eugenics movement. But one Kellogg established what was called the Race Betterment Office in Battle Creek, Michigan, and promoted the ideas of eugenics. You can go on Wikipedia and look and see that in Kansas City at a fair, they started Fitter Families. And it was a competition to say, you know, you might have a large family, but how fit are they? How overall attractive are they? How intelligent are they? And so for many scientists and just all kinds of different intellectuals in Germany, they looked at what America was doing and they could copy a great deal of it and implement it in German society. Of course, in the German strain of the eugenics movement, they would argue that Germans are Aryans and therefore they are the unquestionable most superior people. But of course, within the Aryan community, there were people who were mentally ill. There were people who were born with deformities. There were people born with disabilities. And so they viewed this as a dragging down on the Aryan superiority. And so there's definitely an interconnection, and some of the policies that Hitler will later implement, such as the marriage law, where by 1935, if you were engaged to be married, you were required under German law to go to a Nazi-approved health official and be both evaluated physically and mentally. And you had to have a certificate that would allow you to either get married or a document that said you were forbidden to marry. And although that was, whenever I tell my students that, they're very shocked. Oh my goodness, you can't marry anyone you want. The Nazis were already looking to the United States with its anti-miscegenation laws about who could marry who, and all other types of marriage laws that the United States had put into effect as well. So there's definitely conversations, there's a lot of communications overseas between America and Germany in that eugenics community. And in the very beginning, again, many German eugenicists thought America was going too fast and too far. But once Hitler's in power, all restrictions are off. And so the eugenicists who embrace the more radical approaches are the ones that Hitler is going to work most closely with.
Well, that's a good actually segue into my next question, which is, you know, considering that the community and the leadership thought that the United States had gone too far, but eventually it's Germany that takes it from sterilization to murder. So what's the rationale behind that, and how did people buy into this?
Right. Well, I think for many historians, what we tend to look back to the First World War and say the shocking level of brutality until the Second World War. The First World War is the kind of shattering impact that it had, that no one had seen that a number of casualties before in human history. And so for many people, they were already hardened and brutalized by what they had experienced in the First World War. Then we add in for Germany in the 1920s, an era of hyperinflation, the likes of which I don't think any of us, thankfully, can really imagine. And what we're talking about, by 1923, one German mark was worth 4.2 trillion American dollars. So it's literally, money is worthless in Germany. And so for many German people, their concerns that the Nazis are pinpointing, beginning with the early Nazi Party in the 1920s, is the economic burden of taking care of the children, the ones that you're seeing on your screen now, children with disabilities that can't be cared for at home by their parents. And so the parents must pay to have their children institutionalized. And a great deal of Nazi propaganda targets this economic factor. We saw that in the first slide, that there was an attempt made to say, look, a disabled, a hereditarily diseased individual is costing the same amount of money to care for that one person that a family of 5 healthy Aryans could live off of. And so the Nazis are very keen to stress and drive home this point. These are economic burdens in a time that people don't have the ability to pay and take care of them. And they tend in their propaganda to try to really present pictures of handicapped with criminals. And in many of the films that the Nazi regime produces, you have the depiction of criminals, and usually they're portrayed in very idyllic prison yard settings where the sun is shining and there's green grass and they're just sitting around laughing. Then they juxtapose that image with a severely handicapped person also being taken care for, looking like they're in the lap of luxury. And then they segue to the squalor of an inner city where healthy Aryans are living in filth and in tenement housing. And they're trying to bombard the German people with, if you didn't have to pay for supporting criminals and the handicapped, you wouldn't have to live in these slum-like conditions, that you as a healthy Aryan would be relieved of this burden. And I think that combined with the kind of hardening of feelings from the experiences of the First World War opened up some people to the possibility of saying, yeah, these are individuals that are a drain on our society, and we need to do something about it. Something has to be done. And that something that has to be done is originally the idea of involuntary sterilization, right? So that those criminal elements, and being handicapped has been criminalized by the Nazi regime, that those criminals, at the very least, cannot reproduce and pass on their genetic history to yet another generation. So I don't know if that answers the question, but that's at least my attempt to help you to kind of put it in this larger context, that there's an atmosphere. And even though today we look at the teachings of the eugenics movements as being extremely racist, prejudiced, every negative thing that we can think of, in its heyday, the eugenics movement was embraced by well-respected people. It was seen as a scientific theory that was going to improve the human race. And I can see that one person already typed in that this is making her incredibly angry. And you are right on the money, right? That this is, it is something that it's very difficult to wrap our minds around, that people would actually accept that something has to be done about the handicapped because they're dragging us down. It's offensive, right? But it wasn't necessarily offensive to people in the 1920s and 1930s.
So Beth, I want to pose a question here that we received from one of our participants listening in. This one comes from B, and she asks, were parents of handicapped children convinced to relinquish their children to the state, or were children taken by force?
That's a very good question. In most of the cases, the children that are going to be ultimately in the children's euthanasia program that will be murdered, those were children who were already institutionalized. So they were already being cared for in different facilities. In many cases, the parents are simply lied to. The physicians at the facility and a Nazi official meet with mom and dad, and they say, you know, there's a new facility that just opened up, and it's got state-of-the-art care and new technology and all kinds of new therapies. Don't you want what's best for your child? And won't you sign this document that allows us to take your child from the care facility you've put them in and transport them to the state-of-the-art new place? And so many parents with that type of information and maybe that hope that a breakthrough is going to happen for their child, many of them sign that document. Now that allows those children to be transported out of the original care facility. And generally speaking, those children were taken a great distance from their parents. And that way it would become physically difficult for parents to check in regularly on their child. And that would then allow those particular killing centers, and there were about 30 or so different so-called clinics all across Germany that had been established, and they starved children to death, or they opted to give them a lethal overdose of medication so that it was, in their minds, a quick death. And then parents would just get a letter notifying them that their child had died suddenly. And this is where many of the information and rumors begin to circulate that these children that are dying, the letters are form letters. And so many of the form letters say, well, we're so sorry. Your child was making excellent progress, but his appendix burst. We rushed him into surgery and we couldn't save him. Well, that might work for some parents, right? But then for some parents, they say, now, wait a minute, my child had his appendix removed. So appendixes don't grow back, right? How could he die of a burst appendix? And so the nature of these form letters are very sloppy, and it begins to raise doubts in people's minds about what exactly is going on in these so-called state-of-the-art care facilities that their children have been sent to. I'll stop there in case, yes.
Yeah, thank you, because there's
Sure.
another question here that I want to address, and this one comes from Sophie, and she writes, were deaf Jewish children sterilized as children, and they couldn't have children later in life after they were liberated from the camps?
For anyone who was hereditary born deaf was a possible target. They would have been targeted for sterilization. You could appear before the hereditary health courts and try to argue that you should not be sterilized, but unless you could prove that you had hearing from the time you were born and that you lost it later in life. And I can only think of one concrete example I can give you of one person who was a man who had fought for Germany in the First World War, and he had been denounced as being deaf and needing to be sterilized. He wasn't Jewish, but these programs applied to anyone, Jews or non-Jews. And he was summoned to the hereditary health court and put on trial. And he was able to get his school teachers, and I should mention that in the hereditary health courts, only men could serve as witnesses, because the idea was that women were inferior, that women were incapable of being objective and reasonable, and they were like children. They wouldn't know the difference between the truth and a lie. And so he brought in male school teachers who had taught him as a young person, and they were able to verify that he was a fully functioning hearing person. He lost his hearing fighting for Germany in the First World War. His hearing was damaged and he lost it because of that. He's one of the very few people who was then allowed to not be sterilized. I mentioned at the very beginning with Alana's first question that 259,000 denunciations came in. The Nazis heard in their hereditary health courts, they sentenced 224,000 of those people. They heard those cases, and 90% of them resulted in involuntary sterilization. So there are very few so-called success stories where people were able to walk out of the hereditary health court without a due date to show up at a clinic to be sterilized. But that one man who had lost his hearing is one of those cases. Now, there's another terrible irony. In that 10% who were able to argue that they should not be sterilized, some of them made an arrangement with the court that they would put themselves at their own expense into a single-sex institution, right? Meaning that they'd have no opportunity for sexual relations with someone of the opposite sex. They could never reproduce. Some of those people that escaped being sterilized are going to be picked up later in the Euthanasia Project, where they will meet another fate in a gas chamber instead. So, Sophie, I'm kind of not directly answering your question, but the best I can do is give you the examples that I'm familiar with. And for many people, that even if they were sterilized, particularly your question about a Jewish deaf person who might have been sterilized, they could then still get picked up in the war years and deported to a ghetto or into a concentration camp where they would then lose their lives entirely.
So Beth, you mentioned how the population was mostly behind this idea of sterilization, hence the many denunciations.
Mm-hmm.
And with all of this support, the Nazis still were trying to keep the deaths a secret. So that brings me, actually, that is problematic for me on a couple levels. How did they keep it a secret? I mean, clearly they weren't that good at keeping it a secret. And they must have felt that what they were doing was questionable if they needed to keep it a secret.
Right. Okay, so, well, here
can you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, let me differentiate here. The sterilization program was well publicized, right? And so that's out in the open. The Nazis tried to give it an air of legality by having a parallel legal system, what I call those hereditary health courts. They were completely separate from any other type of judicial system in Germany. But Hitler had come to the conclusion, German people aren't revolutionary, but they admire and respect law and order. And so if we do things with the appearance of legality, even the people who are not necessarily in favor of it are going to be quiet about it because it's the law. So the sterilization of people was out in the open. It was publicized. You can pick up German women's magazines directed at housewives, telling them your duty as a German woman, as a mother, is to protect the greater good of society. And so this might seem cruel and heartless to denounce your neighbor down the street who's got a mentally disabled child, but you're really looking out for the greater community. It's your duty, it's your responsibility. Teachers, nurses, social workers, anyone could submit an anonymous denunciation saying that family needs to be investigated and possibly some people need to be sterilized. So that's that's not kept secret at all, right? And what Hitler's finding out is that people are jumping on this bandwagon. They're participating in the destruction of people's abilities to reproduce. What kind of becomes the attempt to keep things secret is what they called the Euthanasia Project, right? And so that's slightly different, and that's an escalation. Many people were all on board for sterilizing people so that they couldn't reproduce, but it was a greater leap forward to convince German people that the so-called mercy killing, which is the technical term of euthanasia, that mercy killing of the handicapped and the disabled had to be carried out. Now, these were ideas that had been written about in a very famous book in the 1920s. A psychiatrist and a lawyer teamed up and they wrote a book called The Destruction of Life Unworthy of Living. And they argued that you're actually doing a mercy by killing people who are disabled. You're putting them out of their misery. But Hitler wasn't too sure if German people would be on board with actual state murder of its own citizens. And so the Euthanasia Project is the attempt to try to keep things kind of on the down low, keep things secret. All the while, the Nazis are also promoting the idea that euthanasia is a helpful thing. You're a good person if you denounce someone and it leads to them being murdered, because it's a mercy killing, right? And so they put one of the most famous films the Nazi regime puts out is called I Accuse. It's about, it's completely false in the way that it presents what the Nazis are in reality really doing. It's a beautiful young woman. She's married to a doctor. She finds out early in her marriage, she thinks she's pregnant. She goes to the physician and finds out, you're not pregnant, you have multiple sclerosis. It's a degenerative disease and you're going to suffer towards the end of your life. And so she begins to contemplate taking an overdose, right? And she needs the medication from her husband, the doctor. And ultimately, her husband does overdose her on medication and murders her. Then in the movie, there's a trial. All different positions are debated about, was this a mercy killing? Did he honor his wife's wishes? And in the end, the husband is set free. Right? 15 million German people saw that film. And many of them saw it not once, but many times over. And so there was this attempt on the Nazi regime's part to kind of glamorize and to kind of sugarcoat what they were really doing. What they were really doing in their euthanasia project was targeting children and adults with severe handicaps, with severe disabilities, but also people who had fallen into categories such as feeble-mindedness, which could mean almost anything that they wanted it to mean, and they were murdering them. And so what they're actually doing and calling euthanasia is vastly different from the propaganda, but they're trying to slowly bring the German population along with this idea of, if you talk about euthanasia, you're actually performing a mercy, because these people are so disabled, they don't live a life. And so it's better to just put them out of their misery. None of the people who were victimized by the Nazis ever asked to be put out of their misery. Okay? No one asked for that. So it's a complete violation of the idea of euthanasia in and of itself. So that's the program that the Nazis want to keep secret until they're more sure that German people will endorse it. And one of the ways they do it is that when they interview the doctors and the nurses and all the personnel at these killing centers, they tell them what they're going to be doing, right? You're going to be killing people and you have a choice. You can take the job or not. And the people who take the job are okay. And they sign an oath of secrecy that they won't tell anyone what they actually do at these so-called care facilities.
I mean,
Is that kind of,
this is hard for me to wrap my brain around, that that a doctor and a nurse would be able to justify that this is okay, and yet also agree that they must keep it a secret because
Right.
clearly you don't want other people to know about it.
Yeah, that
So,
right away suggests guilt, right? That if you
yes.
think that what the Nazis had done is Hitler, on his private stationery, had authorized the use of a new type of killing technology, and that was a gas chamber. The first experiment of killing disabled people in a gas chamber happened in probably December of 1939, possibly January of 1940. We're not exactly sure of the date, but they took 8 severely disabled men and they brought them to an abandoned prison outside of Berlin in a place called Brandenburg. And they had converted a basement room into a sealed gas chamber. Hitler, some of his private physicians, other Nazi leaders, Hitler and the top Nazis were not present for this experiment, but the 8 men were put into this gas chamber. Chemists injected carbon monoxide into the chamber while the so-called viewing party watched through a slit in the door. And ultimately, all 8 men died from suffocation, and the experiment was deemed a success. The doctors that were present told Hitler that this was an effective way of killing people by using the gas chamber method. And then Hitler okayed it, right? So we as historians always kind of tear our hair out that we don't have a document of Hitler signing kill all Jews throughout all of the world, right? We don't have that. But what we do have is on Hitler's personal stationery, his authorization to use gas, poisonous gas as the killing agent in this so-called Euthanasia Project. So what that means is that when doctors and nurses were being interviewed, they were shown a copy of Hitler's personal stationery with his signature, and they would be told, we can't make this a law just yet, but Hitler was already the dictator of Germany, and his words had the force of law. So they'd say, you will never face punishment for what you're doing, legal punishment, because here you have this document signed by Hitler. And so what you're doing is actually legal, but we just haven't gotten around to making it an official law on the books. And for some individuals, they were already members of eugenics movements. So they already, doctors and nurses believe that they're doing the greater good for society, right? And here you see a picture of some of the nursing staff at one of the notorious places, Hadamar Euthanasia Center. And so for many of them, there's a study done by a man named Michael Burley, and it's in a book called Death and Deliverance. And I would really recommend anyone who's interested in knowing about the sterilization project and the euthanasia campaign to look at Death and Deliverance as a book. This man is a historical detective. He tracked many of the nurses that you see in these pictures, and he kind of went into some of their backgrounds. And for them, this was this job as a nurse at these killing centers was upward social mobility, right? This was a good paying job. And so as long as they didn't want to keep track of how many people they helped murder, they were okay with it. And one of the nurses, not necessarily from Hadamar, but one of the nurses that was involved in these euthanasia projects believed in it so much so that when she was transferred to a nursing unit on the Eastern Front in Soviet territory, she was euthanizing, she was murdering wounded German soldiers that she had decided they were never really going to be able to fight for Germany again. So she might as well just kill them, because now they were worthless. And so that really does show you how many doctors and nurses bought into not only the eugenics movement, but into Nazi ideology about Aryan health and fitness and superiority. And when you were no longer fit and useful, then you should be done away with. It is the ultimate in social Darwinist thinking. If you are not fit to survive, then you deserve to die. And that was at the core of Hitler's own belief system. And that permeated all the rest of Nazi ideology.
Well, it puts medicine, I think, on a very slippery slope on, who do we decide is worthy of
Yes.
surviving and who would we be better off without, or who are we doing justice to by
Exactly.
allowing them not to live.
And at one point, some historians call it the doctors are as gods in white coats, right? They get to play God because they get to determine what are the desirable qualities that we want. What's the list of undesirable qualities? And so it's a very unscientific approach to deciding who gets to be held up in society as the superior people and who is put down, and then who's ultimately their very lives are threatened. And doctors played a pivotal role. More physicians joined the SS units than any other profession because they got to determine who's valuable and who's not.
So when looking at some of this history in preparation for this, for your presentation today, as I mentioned in the introduction, one of the things I found out was that Washington State was just the second state in the country to legalize involuntary sterilization. And I feel like I grew up in Washington State. This was never something I learned. It was never something that was part of our history classes. And I want to include in my question to you another question that came in from David here, who says, is it fair to say that Germany has been more forthcoming about this chapter in history than the US and their role?
That's a very good question. And I think that the answer would be yes, Germany has been forced to confront their role in promoting eugenics ideas and implementing them, right? Not enough, they weren't just discussing, who's superior and who's not. They were actually killing people that they felt were inferior and had undesirable traits. And so I think that I'm not an American historian, right? So my specialty is German history. There are plenty of works and research out there about America and the eugenics movement. But I think it's something that, as you point out, a lot of students just think, well, that would never happen in America, right? That would never happen here. And yet it did. It was happening here before it happened in Germany, right? Now, the Germans took it 5 steps further, right? But I think that it is an issue. And just kind of, again, in preparation for our presentation today, I just kind of did a random search and I found that in California, as of 2013, they had sterilized involuntarily. They said that it was voluntary, but the gist of it was that 148 women held in a California correctional institution were sterilized. And that was 2013. Now, the American government had passed in 1978 a federal law about regulating sterilization. But this is, partly why you have single-sex institutions for particularly mentally disabled people. It's because the fear is that if you put a female mentally disabled patient with a male disabled patient, they're going to have sex and they're going to produce a mentally disabled child. And so this really, it really does still need to be addressed. It would be beneficial if students in their earlier years, perhaps in high school history classes, would actually learn a little bit about what was going on in American history. A lot of students don't have any idea about the role of doctors and nurses in America. We could look to the Tuskegee medical experiments on African American men who had syphilis, and they were experimented on like rats, and many of them lost their lives. And doctors didn't tell them what they had and what they were being treated for. And so there's all kinds of abuses there's plenty, unfortunately, to go around. But because of Germany's history in the Holocaust, they've been forced to really confront their own history in a way that maybe Americans have been able to avoid.
So there must have been some doctors who were interviewed for positions, or nurses, or even parents of children who refused to take on this role, refused to send their children, understood what was going on, and resisted this, or said no,
Yes,
or informed upon it. So, what kind of resistance
there's
or
varying.
opposition existed?
Right, there's varying forms. The first one that comes to my mind is a Protestant minister named with the name Bodelschwing. So that's a mouthful there. But Pastor Bodelschwing not only was a minister in the Protestant church, but he also ran a care facility for people with severe epilepsy. And as you stated at the very opening, that hereditary law it targeted people with epilepsy as well. And he became very suspicious early on because he, as the director of this institution, received a packet of blank questionnaires with the instructions that he and his staff were to fill out a questionnaire on every single patient in their care facility. And then they were to bundle up the questionnaires and mail them back to Berlin to a house, a very nice house called Tiergarten Strasse number 4. And that was the headquarters of the adult euthanasia program. Of course, it was secret, right? So he, reading the questions on the questionnaire, realized depending on how we answer these questions, something might happen to my patients and it might not be good. And so he called a staff meeting, brought all of his staff together, and said, I am going to refuse to fill out these questionnaires. And if you are with me, that's great. Every single member of his staff, the nurses, everyone who worked there, agreed with Bodelschwing and said, we won't fill out the forms. Well, then Bodelschwing went further. Well, in the end, it didn't matter because the T-4, the euthanasia personnel came from Berlin to his clinic and they filled out the forms themselves, right? But in the meanwhile, Bodelschwing demanded to have meetings with all various Nazi leaders and tried to get more information. And ultimately, he linked up with a man that I wrote my dissertation about, a Roman Catholic bishop in the town of Münster in northwestern Germany. This man's name was Bishop Clemens August Graf von Galen. And Bodelschwing had a blank copy of the questionnaire. He gave it to this Roman Catholic church leader and said, I think they're trying to kill patients. And this led then Bishop von Galen, now with this concrete proof in his hand of these questionnaires, to deliver a sermon in August of 1941, a public sermon where he denounced the Nazis' euthanasia program. And that, of course, got all kinds of coverage and so forth. And the Nazis wanted to kill the bishop, but he was too high profile, so they couldn't. So that was one method of trying to take on the Nazis. We have cases of not just parents of children, but children whose parents were being targeted for in the adult euthanasia program. And I have one case that always stands out in my mind of a woman whose mother had been taken away and she had been murdered in a gas chamber. But the woman received a form letter that said that her mother had died of pneumonia. And so this woman, at her own expense, traveled a great distance, walked part of the way to get to the so-called care facility where her mother died. And she stood outside the gates demanding a meeting with the director of the facility. And of course, they're not going to meet with her because if she walked into the facility, the first thing she might recognize is that there are no patient beds, right? That the facility has beds for the nurses and the doctors who live on the premises, but there are no beds for patients. because the patients are brought in by bus, they're taken to a basement, they're undressed, and they're put into a gas chamber and murdered. And then their bodies are cremated. And so finally, this woman who wouldn't go away because she simply didn't believe that her mother had died of pneumonia, she was told, if you don't go away and be quiet, you're going to disappear too. And so she went away. And so there was never a mass protest. There was never a march through the streets of Germany of parents of children who had been murdered, or of loved ones that, you know, took to the streets and said, you killed my mother, you killed my grandfather. And I always tell my students, the important thing to think about is that, what did Hitler learn from that? When a parent or a child will not go out and protest that the government has murdered their own family member whom they profess to love, Hitler said, if they won't defend people they say they love, are they going to defend people that they already hate and have stereotypes and prejudice against? And this is the timing of the beginning of mass deportations of Jews out of German-controlled territories into the East. Because Hitler says, look, they're not taken to the streets to protect their children. If they won't protect their own children, are they going to protect Jews? I don't think so, right? And so Hitler is learning as he goes, from the sterilization to this Euthanasia Project. And of course, the Euthanasia Project has given people, the Nazi regime, the technology of how to kill large numbers of people efficiently and effectively via a gas chamber. And so I think for many people, they just don't realize that there were gas chambers murdering people on German soil long before we get to 1940, 41, and the construction of major death camps in Eastern Europe.
So we really start to see how this is a precursor.
Yes.
So in our last few minutes, Beth, I want to pose another question to you and and bring this around a little bit to what we're seeing today. It seems that in today's society, we continue to discount and devalue people with mental illness and physical disabilities. And we see this even during COVID-19. The spread of the disease ran through hospitals and institutions for people with mental illness, but we really heard very little about it. And as a society, we continue to shame and hide mental illness. And I think this makes this population all the more vulnerable to abuse. Are there protections and checks that have evolved from this terrible history? And how has this history influenced our medical profession and medical ethics today?
Well, I would say to anyone who's part of our audience, if you've gone to a doctor at any point in time in your life and you're sitting there and they say you're going to need some type of procedure, that is automatically followed up by a whole lot of paperwork, right? You get forms, and people usually groan, oh, these forms. That is directly a consequence of what are called the doctors' trials that began in 1946 at the end of World War II. Because of the doctors' trials, the medical profession had to rewrite its code of ethics. And it's sometimes called the Nuremberg Code, right? And it's because of the Nuremberg war crimes trials and these doctors' trials when the world learned that doctors and nurses, who you think are supposed to do everything to protect life and at least do no harm, were involved in the actual selections and in deciding who was valuable and who was less valuable. And because of that, you get informed consent paperwork. So every time you're at a doctor's office and you have to fill out a form that says, I understand what this procedure is, it's been explained to me, or I understand what this medication is and what its effects might be, that is directly a result of the Holocaust and the Euthanasia Project and forced sterilization. That patients can no longer, at least in an ideal world, can no longer be used as guinea pigs for different types of experiments and tortures, right? And so that informed consent grows directly out of it. And so that's at least something positive that emerges in the aftermath of World War II and the Holocaust, right? That there's an awareness that doctors and nurses abused their authority, they abused their skill set, and that the profession had to rethink what exactly constituted ethical professional behavior. So those at least are some of the types of protocols that have been put in place. As far as mental institution, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh no, I was gonna say, actually, that's so interesting that you point that out, because we see that in our everyday life, this connection to this
And people have
history.
no idea. People have no idea, right? I mean, usually people are like, oh, I don't want to read the paperwork. I don't want to sign it, right? Or I'll sign it, but I don't want to read all of it. But it's a direct consequence of doctors and nurses who abused their power and justified it in the name of eugenics, right? And so that's most definitely a direct result of what happened during World War II and the years building up to it.
So Beth, you have so much incredible information, and I'm sorry that we are out of time with our program, but it's just really amazing, the personal stories that you're able to bring up along with the history, and how to really humanize this point, and how it became a precursor for what we saw with the Holocaust. So thank you so much for
thank you
being part of this
for having
conversation.
me. Yeah, thank you for allowing me to be here. I really, really appreciate it so much. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone who joined into our program today. This program has been recorded, and you'll find it on our website starting tomorrow. We couldn't offer programs like this one without our supporters and our donors. So if you are listening and you're able, please consider making a donation on our website, holocaustcenterseattle.org. Just click the donate link in the top right corner of the page. Thank you for your support. At the Holocaust Center for Humanity, it takes a very motivated and dedicated team to continue offering a large variety of programs virtually, including book talks, programs for young adults, and teacher workshops. Our next one is July 29th, and if you check our website tomorrow, you will find all the information. I want to again thank Dr. Beth Griech-Polelle for all of her research and information, and for joining us today. I want to thank Richard Green, our Museum and Technology Director, who's running the technical side of this show. And also our team at the Holocaust Center, our Executive Director, Dee Simon, and the rest of our team, Nicole Vella, Lori Warshall-Cohen, Julia Thompson, Paul Regelbrug, Rosa Campos, Sydney Dradell, Ellie Selesky, Amanda Davis, and Katie Lawrence. I hope you all will be able to join us next Tuesday at the same time for a special program with Jessica Fenton, who's the granddaughter of Polish Holocaust survivors. Jessica is a member of our Speakers Bureau and shares her grandparents' incredible story of luck and resilience. Thank you again for joining us today, and we hope to see you next week. This concludes our program.